The Tom Woods Show, episode 1692.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Folks, by now you've probably noticed that news about the virus is almost always fact-free hysteria these days. So you need my brand new free ebook, Your Facebook Friends Are Wrong About the Lockdown. Go pick it up at wrongaboutlockdown.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. I am very glad to be joined by somebody I should have had as a guest so long ago. Fellow Ron Paul curriculum co-creator. Both of us almost lost our minds during that excruciating process, but I'm so glad to welcome Timothy Terrell to the show. He's a professor of economics at Wofford College, and I want to talk about some environmental issues with him. And you may say, Woods, we got all these things going on in the world. We got Black Lives Matter, we got the virus, we got the lockdowns. But you know, as I've told you, I talk too much about that stuff as it is. There are other things in life. Life has to go on at some point, and these are important questions for libertarians and libertarian economists to be able to answer. So we're doing it. So Timothy, welcome.
Glad to be here with you, Tom.
All right, let's talk about, first of all, tell me about your college. Tell me the good parts. We'll get into the gossip later. And also what it's been like teaching under the current circumstances.
Right. So Wofford is really a great place, and I've been there for 20 years now, a little over 20 years. And when I came to Wofford, I was excited because it was focused on what I really wanted to do, which is teach. And I didn't want to get into one of those publish or perish institutions where I had to publish in the right journal, or I wasn't going to get tenure or get promoted or anything like that. And so Wofford's a great little place. It's in a smaller southern city, under 2,000 students. It's a liberal arts college. We get bright students. We get well-motivated students. It's a great place to be.
And what state is it in?
South Carolina.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have thoroughly enjoyed teaching there, although the last few months have definitely been interesting.
I have been hearing stories from everybody because, of course, you and I have a lot of professor friends. And I have not yet run into one who said, this is a dream come true.
No. And I don't think you'll hear that from anybody in the situation. Nobody wanted to be in a situation where we've got to radically shift our teaching methods and adapt our content even to what we can capably do in the classroom on short notice. And I don't think the students are thrilled about having to be on a screen as much as they are. I know faculty have had to do some radical shifts, and some of us are less comfortable with the technology that's required than others of us. And so we are doing our best. And I think at Wofford, we're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah. But one of the problems you run into online is the problem of people cheating. It's much easier to spot them cheating when they're sitting in your classroom and they have notes written on their arm.
Right.
But the online, so I better not say the name, but there's another faculty member here. We're at the Mises Institute right now as I'm recording this, who told me that because of the way they're going to be doing next year with some bits of it online, the last part of it's going to be online, like the last couple of weeks will be just online. They're afraid that if your final exam counts for a large percentage of the final grade, and that part is online, there's a great chance that people might cheat, and that will skew their grade, in one direction. So they're saying reshuffle the weight, the weighted average of the grade in favor of the in-class period, and try to make the final not so important. But I'm supposed to somehow rearrange all this for one semester because presumably it won't be going on forever. There are a lot of things to bear in mind here.
Oh, yeah. And one of the things we've got going for us being in a small college with smaller classes is I can give exams that are essays. And if I give them permission to open a resource, a book or something like that, and they're writing essays, it's harder for them, if they were inclined to be dishonest about it, to copy somebody's work without it becoming obvious.
Yeah, right. All right, so that's the struggle that you're facing. Let's just one last thing. Are you going to be in person and when I say in the fall, that's coming up, right?
Yeah,
in a month.
That's real short, and it's coming right up, and we are planning to go back face-to-face, although that's going to be with some masking, I think, and some social distancing and all of that. But, I think a lot of us are eager to go back face-to-face because a lot of the students are getting more out of college than just the content that we're delivering in the classroom. which honestly, there's so much on the internet right now that if you really were a determined, motivated student, you could find out all of this information on your own. It's the process of learning how to discipline yourself in an academic environment. And honestly, the social part of being at college is a big part of why students want to get back. And I understand that. I've got three children who are in college right now, and they're struggling with all of this as well.
I wonder about what long-term effects there will be. Maybe none. Maybe there will be none because every year people say, oh, it's getting so expensive. Eventually, this is a bubble that's going to pop and people will stop sending their kids. But that doesn't seem to be happening. And parents think that it's kind of like how kids feel about grade inflation. In general, they're against it, but don't abolish it till after I graduate.
Right.
So same thing, other kids, they should try alternatives to education, but I want my kid to have that Harvard degree.
That's right. And I think that the purposes of higher education, whether they're good or bad, or if it's something that's related to understanding subject matter, or if it's simply a signaling process where you're getting a certificate that says that you went through 4 years of a dedicated study process, and that shows the employer something about yourself and your character and your ability to carry out a long-term project. Whatever the purpose is of that higher education, that's still going to be in place after this coronavirus thing. So there are a lot of colleges that I think are going to struggle, and some may not make it through this because they're going into this with some major financial problems.
Yeah.
So this is going to end up with some colleges, I think, not making it through. And that is something that I think is probably just hastening the inevitable for some of these places.
Right. So one of the things I was asking a guest last week, we will get to the environment in a minute, but was how do I reconcile these two phenomena? I mean, on the one hand, I know that the state really, really takes seriously its control over education. I mean, yes, there's private schooling and homeschooling, but the vast majority of people go to the government schools, and they like it that way for obvious reasons. They need it to be that way. And by making all these crazy demands of, let's say, even K through 12 education with social distancing and masking and staggering schedules and canceling this and that and making it as barren and prison-like as possible, they're driving people into alternatives. And yet, so you would think they'd stop doing this because their number one goal has to be get those kids in those government school classrooms. And yet, by doing the crazy stuff, they're driving a lot of them away. It seems like they're at cross purposes with themselves. I can't make sense of this unless they genuinely believe there's a real danger from the virus.
Right. And I've got, my brother and sister both homeschool their kids, and my wife teaches at a private school, and I've got friends that teach in public schools. And so the K through 12 environment is the kind of thing where I see a real growth opportunity for things like the Ron Paul curriculum, for private education of all kinds, for homeschoolers. I think that a lot of people are going to get really upset with the way that the government is handling K through 12 education. And they're going to want to make a move. And they're going to think, well, if I've got to stay home and supervise my kid on Zoom with some not very well motivated teacher on the other end, with all the handicaps that technological barrier puts into place, I think you're going to really see some changes in how people approach education for their own kids, especially parents that really care deeply about what's going on with their kids.
RonPaulHomeschool.com is my link for the Ron Paul curriculum. I give away some bonuses if people get it through there. And you did a course on
personal finance
for young people. So I think I do want to say a little something about that. I'd like you, because I've looked at the topics that you cover on there. Oh my gosh, if after learning all that stuff you screw up, well, all you can say is it's not Timothy Terrell's fault.
Yeah, well, and there are some pretty advanced topics in there. How to buy a car and things like that. There's an age range there where students might look at that and say, well, I'm not really close to that yet, but it will come faster than you think. And a lot of parents need to make sure that their kids are engaged when it comes to personal finance, because those early years, people can make a lot of mistakes that are difficult to recover from.
That's right. And not to mention, there are a lot of people who, when they become adults and they hear about your course and they look back and think, if only I had learned this, if I had only somebody had explained to me, in effect, how the world works, I could have avoided a lot of the pitfalls I fell into. So that's the kind of thing that I think some people, when they look at the Ron Paul curriculum, what they assume it is it's like history from a libertarian perspective and economics from a libertarian perspective. I mean, in a sense it is, although in my courses I am trying to let people understand this is the mainstream way of looking at it. Here's another way of looking at it. But it's so much more than that. It's not just that we have the same courses they have but taught differently. We have completely different courses in some cases from what they have. In addition to what they have, we've got your course.
And we're optimistic about what we think these kids can learn. We think that they can handle this material. And I've gotten feedback from the students that have gone through my course saying that they really have benefited from it.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, no doubt. All right, let's talk about the environment now. So I'm going to have to pitch this episode as two topics. So the second one is the environment. This is the classic example of what people think of when they think market failure in a textbook sense. That they'll say that that's just the way capitalism is. It can't take into account these kinds of externalities and the damage that's done to the air and whatever, because nobody owns the air and there's no way to solve these sorts of problems apart from government intervention, regulation of various kinds. There really is no other way to think about it or solve these problems. So it goes to show, even friends of the market economy will say that it goes to show that as great as the market is, it's not perfect. It can't do everything. It needs to be supplemented by, frankly, a monopoly on the use of force in the service of causes that we believe in deeply that are not served by the market. What's wrong with that way of thinking?
Right. So a lot of this, the problem with this way of looking at the environment is that people are comparing the market to some kind of fairy tale world of perfect efficiency where the government's going to be able to eliminate the inefficiency without creating any new problems of its own. And we know that that's absolutely not possible. I mean, anytime the government steps in to try to correct something that's allegedly an inefficiency with the marketplace, then it's going to incur its own costs. It's going to have, among other things, you're going to have rent-seeking, this lobbying kind of activity by firms that see an opportunity in government regulation to boost their own profits, what we call crony capitalism, where a firm says, well, if we regulate this part of the environment, I've got a product to sell that'll help with that. Whether it's a technological gadget that allows air pollution to be reduced or some other kind of approach to cutting back on pollution that puts money in their pocket. And when we look at environmental problems and the ways that governments intervene, it's almost inevitable that governments are going to be captured by these kinds of interests. And that's part of the problem with looking at this as a failed market versus government riding out on a white horse to solve the problem and save the day. It's just not going to happen that way. And anybody who approaches an environmental problem with that kind of discussion of market failure without also talking about the sizable and usually even more profound government failures is being dishonest.
Well, I'm thinking back to when I had one of the times I had Pat Buchanan on the show, and he was talking about his book on Nixon. And I hate to be the one to break to Pat, who loved Nixon, that Nixon's not really ideal from a free market point of view. That's nothing Pat doesn't know already. But I said, my gosh, man, I mean, this guy domestically was a complete disaster. I mean, forget about foreign policy. Domestically, he was a disaster. And he was sort of willing to concede some of it, but he said, but look, Tom, our rivers and lakes were polluted, the air was polluted. And so the fact is, what people will look at is they'll say, we had a Clean Air Act, we had a Clean Water Act, and after those things, we had cleaner air and cleaner water. So how, other than just being pig-headed, how can a libertarian dispute that?
Yeah, so I have students that write papers on these issues all the time, and they'll often present data on environmental quality that starts with, say, 1970, the year the EPA was founded, and they show that pollution fell after 1970. Well, yeah, of course it did. We're getting more prosperous. The economy's growing. People can afford the kinds of technologies that allow for a cleaner environment. But if you go back and look before 1970, in a lot of cases, you see that the environment was already getting better with some of these measures. And that's part of the dishonesty. If you can pick the time frame that you're looking at environmental quality, yeah, you can find a coincidental, perhaps, connection between environmental regulation and environmental quality. But one of the things that I talk about with my classes is this thing called an environmental Kuznets curve, which shows that, initially when an economy is growing, the environment's going to have some problems. We're going to start to see, for example, like in London, when there was the Industrial Revolution early on, everybody's burning coal and the air quality is declining. But as that that economy improves, you reach a point where the environmental quality stops getting worse and starts getting better. And we sometimes attribute that to regulation because along comes the government to regulate something, often when the pollution is pretty bad, and then we begin to attribute any subsequent improvement in the environment to that government intervention.
They do this all the time. So the example that maybe people have heard me give before involves OSHA, because generally what they'll do is they'll give you the chart from like 1970. And they'll say, look at all how fatalities and injuries on the job have fallen. They don't show you the 25 years before that where they were falling at an even faster rate than that. So that is sort of relevant to the question. All right, let's take a quick break, come right back and talk more about the environment. Folks, let me take just a brief minute to tell you about the way I solve a major problem that we all have. Because we're all intellectuals, we have a pile of books we want to read. We have no idea how we're ever going to get through all of them. And the answer is Blinkist. It's unique and powerful, works on your phone, your tablet, your web browser. It gives you the best key takeaways, the need-to-know information from over 3,000 nonfiction bestsellers in over 27 categories. Blinkist condenses them down into blinks, which you can read or listen to in just 15 minutes. And I like Blinkist because after that 15-minute blink, I know whether or not the full-length audiobook is really a good use of my time. I use Blinkist when I'm driving around in the car, which would otherwise be dead time, and I'm absorbing book after book while I drive. I've listened to these blinks, and I highly recommend you check them out. Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker and The Doomsday Machine by Daniel Ellsberg. Right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Woods to start your free 7-day trial and get 25% off a Blinkist premium membership and up to 65% off audiobooks, yours to keep forever. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/Woods to get 25% off a premium membership and a 7-day free trial. Blinkist.com/Woods. All right, I want to talk to you now about something I have never heard of before, but I know you've done work on it and you're going to explain it to us. And I think this will be the first, let's say maybe the first libertarian podcast audience who has heard about environmental Kuznets curves. What in the heck are you talking about?
Right. So I got interested in this when I was in school because there was just starting to be a literature on this. The term goes back to Simon Kuznets, who was an economist who looked at the relationship between economic growth and inequality. And so that's been adapted to looking at environmental issues where we look at the relationship between economic growth and environmental quality. So the classic environmental Kuznets curve is a kind of an upside-down U, where as you have increased economic growth and prosperity and people are getting richer, they initially are seeing a more polluted environment. And then at some point, and that point varies depending on the pollutant, people become wealthy enough to begin to say, well, that I'm not starving anymore. I've got a roof over my head. My most immediate emergency medical needs are taken care of. And now let's think about that open sewer running behind my house. Maybe spending some money to get that closed in and have an ordinary, a regular sewer system might improve my immediate environment. And so people begin to do this as their economy develops. And as the economy reaches that point for various pollutants, whether that's sulfur dioxide or water pollution or whatever it might be, after you reach that turning point, any subsequent economic growth tends to result in improvement of the environment. Now, I've done some recent research on this. In fact, I've got a paper into a journal right now looking at whether or not these environmental Kuznets curves might not be truly upside-down U-shaped. And there's been a lot of work done to suggest that this is only temporary and that maybe eventually the environment gets even worse because kind of a reversion to the mean or something. And my argument is that actually, at least in the case that I was looking at, we actually do see in a substantial number of cases the classic upside-down U, And we do see that relationship that leads us to believe that if you increase economic growth, you're not necessarily damaging the environment. If you talk to a lot of environmentalists, they'll say, well, there's this trade-off. You got a choice. You can either have economic growth or you can have a clean environment, but you can't have both. And the EKC says, no, you can have both. And in fact, maybe the best way to get environmental quality is to go for economic growth.
So, in other words, in let's say very primitive times, there are ways you could damage the environment even in primitive times. But in primitive times, I don't have as large a scale a way to impact the environment because I'm extremely poor. I can't have that effect on the environment. Then we get wealthy enough that our activities could have a large-scale impact on the environment, but then we get still wealthier to the point where we don't want them to have that effect on the environment. We become more conscious of it because, after all, we have to live in this setting, and so we naturally make choices that are going to make our lived environment more comfortable, I assume.
Sure, yeah. And one example of this would be if you go back, 100, 110 years or something, you find that in urban areas, people are using a lot of animals, draft animals, and they're using horses, for example, to pull carriages around. And horses, of course, create a lot of solid and liquid waste in the city streets. And this is really making life unpleasant in a lot of urban areas because you have all of this animal power. Along comes Henry Ford. He makes it possible for people to afford automobiles. And even though we associate automobiles today with pollution, they would be an environmental bonanza at the time because they mean that you can get away from this polluting animal and towards something that is, in relative terms, a lot less polluting. Certainly a Model T or something would be a lot more polluting per mile than a car of today. But that improvement in the environment was a byproduct of economic growth. As people could afford automobiles, they bought those instead of buying horses, and the environment began to improve. The petroleum industry improved in its environmental cleanliness of operations when John D. Rockefeller came along and said, you can get more than just kerosene out of this petroleum product. You can crack this into gasoline, and we can find uses for all of these different parts of the petroleum product. And as a result, we began to see environmental improvement in the oil-producing parts of the United States. So his search for profit yielded an environmental improvement.
Now, you and I recognize the role of private property in preserving the condition of something. So if I own, doesn't matter what it is, let's say it's a car, I want to preserve not just the functionality of the car in the present moment, but I want to preserve its long-term capital value. I want to the flow of services I can get from it, I want to extend as far out as possible. So I don't go 100 miles an hour over a speed bump, or I don't go 50,000 miles between oil changes. Whereas if I rent a car, I don't know anybody who gets an oil change with a rental car. Doesn't mean that they're bad people, but they just assume somebody else is going to do that. Why would I do it? And I don't say necessarily that when you're renting a car, you go 100 miles an hour over the speed bump, but you might go a little bit faster over it than you would with your own car. So we all get, really anybody gets that. Anybody understands the tragedy of the commons. They can all see it. We all know that if it's something that belongs to us, we take better care of it than if it's, so-called commonly owned. But I think what some, let's say, pro-government sort of environmentalists would say to that is that I can equally well keep something in good shape by the use of force. If the government owns it and just tells everybody, stay away and don't throw waste into this thing or whatever, that's just as good, and we can at least keep an eye on the government, whereas who knows what a private actor is doing. So I think they think the outcome could be the same, or the private actor might, in order to turn a profit, turn a blind eye to what they're doing to the environment, but the government is public. We can keep an eye on it.
If you completely ignore the incentives that government itself faces, if you ignore the fact that these politicians are looking for the next election, which may be 4 years away. They're not looking far off into the future. A stockholder in a firm is considering not only the immediate return on that stock, but is thinking, well, how much is that stock going to be worth 5 years from now, 8 years, 10 years? So you're ignoring not you personally, Tom, but the environmentalist who's making that kind of argument would be ignoring the effect of bureaucracy, which is not interested in efficiency, but is interested in expanding the budget of that bureaucracy, expanding the role of that bureaucracy. The environmentalist who argues this is ignoring the impact of firms that are trying to gain a piece of largesse for themselves out of the regulatory power of government, get a market for their product that everyone has to buy because the government says you have to buy it. So there's all kinds of problems with this kind of argument that are completely being swept under the rug.
What do you think, if anything, the Austrian school in particular might bring to the study of the environment? The Chicago people have done some work on it, and there's that school of free market environmentalism that, among other things, will talk about tradable pollution credits and things like that as ways to take a desirable outcome like clean air, but make sure that that outcome comes about at the least cost to society by making sure that firms that can decrease pollution levels least expensively would be the ones who actually do it, and so it imposes the least burden on society. Where do you come down on all that?
So the problem with that approach, whether it's a tax on pollution or a tradable permit, is that in order to set that tax properly, efficiently, in order to create the correct quota of sulfur dioxide permits, you've got to know something government can't know. You've got to know that the ideal quantity of pollution in the environment is X, and they have no idea what that is. It's not zero. In order to reduce pollution to zero, we'd all have to cease to exist. So we know it's not that, and whatever positive number that is, we don't have any way to find that out. The other problem, I think, with that train of thought, and I understand the appeal of it to somebody who's favorable toward markets, but another part of that is that they're ignoring the kind of moral problems with coercive activity. When you are bringing government in to coerce people to reduce their pollution below a certain level or impose a tax, you're introducing all kinds of other problems that abrogate basic fundamental rights. And that's a separate argument, but I think it's a very powerful one.
Well, with a lot of environmental damage, the issue will tend to be that it would be one thing if the person were damaging only his own personal property. That could be bad enough. But the problem is the work you do, the activity you engage in affects a lot of people downstream, so to speak. So how can we handle the problem of I'm downstream and you're sending pollution down my stream?
Yeah, so many years ago when there was logging in the northern part of the United States, the logging companies would be aware that their operations would generate a certain amount of pollution that would flow downstream to the people living and working along the side of the river. And in order to prevent lawsuits against those firms, they would either outright buy the property downstream, or they would arrange in advance with the people downstream permission to engage in this activity that might generate some damage to the water ability to use that water. So we can use tort law and nuisance law to try to resolve some of these problems, and that actually can be quite effective and much more nuanced in its approach than a one-size-fits-all regulation. You have courts in different places that might make different decisions that are more suited to that particular environment and the needs of the people in that area, which is why we have water law cases that tend to be different in the western part of the United States than we have in the eastern part of the United States. So if we got away from the kind of command and control regulation where government allegedly tries to figure out the most efficient solution for environmental problems, and instead turn to a kind of a tort law using courts to settle disputes about the use of a scarce resource, I think that's much more likely to address the actual problems that victims of pollution face. It actually identifies a victim. I mean, if your company is found in violation of a regulation, that's not necessarily the same thing as compensating the person who has lost something due to your pollution.
Can you think of a good example in environmental issues today that you think demonstrates the superiority of market solutions? Like, for example, endangered species. With something like that, it's pretty clear that if you just tell everybody, if you see a member of this species on your property, you got to inform us and we'll come get it, and then we're going to say that your property is a habitat, you can't develop it. is that really going to preserve the species, or is that going to make them want to put a bullet in that owl's head?
Yeah, so the first thing is sort of like doctors are supposed to first do no harm. So the first thing we want to do with a regulation is not do further damage, and that's in fact what the Endangered Species Act has done. In fact, one of the lawyers that helped to write the Endangered Species Act has acknowledged that this is part of the problem with the outcomes of this regulation, that we're actually creating incentives for people to do what they call shoot, shovel, and shut up. So if you see a red cockaded woodpecker on your forest land and you're harvesting these trees every so often for paper, you know that if the Fish and Wildlife Service finds this colony, then they're going to draw a big circle around it.
Oh, it's pretty gruesome what that shovel is for, I think.
Right. So and we've got documented cases of this kind of thing where if somebody finds a red cockaded woodpecker nest on their property, they don't necessarily shoot, shovel, and shut up, but they might clear cut outside of that circle where otherwise they might not have. And their neighbors do too. So we end up with less habitat instead of more.
It's always interesting to try to think about and anticipate and study so-called unintended consequences of government action. Now, some of these unintended consequences I don't think are so unintended sometimes, but other times I think they genuinely are. Like, for example, this thing about the Endangered Species Act having, in some cases, the opposite of the intended effect reminds me of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is a point Lou Rockwell made at the time. This is like almost 20 years ago now, that if you take a bunch of disabilities that people could have, there's a whole continuum of them, ranging from very minor disabilities all the way to extremely severe. You know, like somebody's confined to a wheelchair and is semi-paralyzed. Well, if the Americans with Disabilities Act says you have to make provision for disabled workers and you have to hire a certain number of them, well, then I'm going to hire the ones who have a hair lip, because that's not going to affect my business at all. They're still considered disabled. So all the people who have the most, the least intrusive disabilities, they'll be fine. But the ones presumably you most want to help will be most sidelined by that.
Right.
And yet you probably wouldn't have guessed that when you implemented that regulation.
Sure. And an example of that, going back to the endangered species issue, is a forest products company, Weyerhaeuser, years ago began funding a search for spotted owls. Some of us are old enough to remember the spotted owl controversy.
I remember the spotted owl.
Yes.
Sure.
So they began funding wildlife biologists to go out and search for these things on forest land. You think, well, why would a forest products company want to find these things? I mean, wouldn't they want to avoid finding spotted owls? Because that's going to lock up that land. And
I don't know the answer. What's the answer?
So Weyerhaeuser's profits went up after they did this because, of course, they weren't looking on their own land. They were looking on federal land, which most of the land in the West, which is being logged, is federal or state land. It's government-owned land. It's not Weyerhaeuser's land. So they were able to lock up a land that did not belong to them so that then their stocks went up.
Oh, my God. How did I not see that? How is Woods not cynical enough yet that I couldn't have anticipated that was the outcome?
Sure. So if you can find something that is an environmental regulation, which if you get it enforced, is going to help you more than your competition. Maybe their competition was more dependent on that federal land than Weyerhaeuser was. Maybe they owned their own land and they could avoid the costs.
Can you link us to? Do you have a link to anything that's readable online on your work on those curves?
Sure. I can send you a link to the paper that's up at ssrn.com, and I can try to find that Wall Street Journal article on the Weyerhaeuser case. That was a number of years ago.
Okay,
but that may still be online.
We'll whatever I'm able to get, I'll link to on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/1692. And then do you have your own personal or professional website?
I do. It's in my Wofford page, at Wofford College. So if you go to the Wofford Wofford, WOFFORD.edu, and look me up.
Terrell, Terrell. Well, I'll also link to your page on the Wofford site at tomwoods.com/1692. Well, I don't want to keep any longer. We got to get downstairs and get ready to go have some dinner. But it was great talking to you, Tim.
Thanks very much,
a lot.
Tom. Yep.
All right, everybody, that's going to do it for today. Yes, apparently it looks like they want to lock us up a little bit longer, or who knows how much longer. I thought with the Black Lives Matter thing that maybe the virus had taken a back seat and we weren't going to hear about that anymore, but Well, here we go again because of surges in so-called cases. So that means if you thought you were going to get away with not reading that Woods ebook, you are sadly mistaken. So check out Your Facebook Friends Are Wrong About the Lockdown over at wrongaboutlockdown.com. You can also get it in the U.S. by texting the word lockdown to the number 33444. I'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.